The temple has played an important role as an economic instrument. Most of the villages that we have in Bharat today, the single biggest institution that is a driver of economic activity, in my view, is the temple. It becomes a central ecosystem of a lot of these village entities. So if you take the past, Cholas and the Pallavas, Pandyas, you find this through and through.
Sriram Balasubramanian is an economist and author with a deep interest in global economics, emerging markets, and Indic culture. His new book, Dharmanomics, explores how the ancient principles of Dharma can guide modern economics towards sustainable growth.
Whether you like these books or not that I've written, one thing you would agree is that this content is intended to make you think.
Namaste and welcome to Bharatvaarta. My name is Kamal Madi Shetty, your host for today. Today we have with us a very special guest, a renowned economist and a best-selling author, Dr. Sriram Balasubramanian. He is somebody who's a familiar face when it comes to the field of Indic economics, somebody who's been on our platform before and has written some amazing books. And the book that we will be discussing today and the subjects that we will be discussing today are from his latest book, which is Dharmanomics, Indigenous and Sustainable Economic Model. Namaste and welcome, Sriramji. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Namaste. Thanks a lot. It's great to be part of this conversation. Thanks, Kamalji. And of course, thanks to Roshan and Thirunarayanan here for a wonderful studio which Bharatvaarta has had. As being a sort of a supporter of Bharatvaarta since its early days, I'm very happy that it's making a lot of progress. And lovely to be part of this show.
Thank you so much, Sriramji, and looking forward to our conversation. Sriramji, first of all, I wanted to ask you to. You've a few years back you were on this platform. You spoke about your previous book, which was focused on Kautilyanomics, and now this is about Dharmanomics. So, why this book? What prompted you to write this book?
Right. So I think like a lot of your listeners would have would remember my conversation on my previous book, which is Kautilyanomics for Modern Times. So what that book essentially did was to try to provide an economic framework to Kautilya's thinking, which of course is based on the Arthashastra, which is a 3rd century BCE text. I pitched this idea called Dharmic Capitalism based on the idea of Kautilya's Arthashastra. I believe that the idea of Dharma was foundational to Kautilya's thinking based on my understanding of the text and interactions with a variety of scholars on the subject. And I bring through the prism of ethics, responsibilities, and social and economic harmony. I map all these into the role of a state, a rule enforcing but non-intrusive state, wealth creation via global outlook, and sustainable growth and welfare. Right. And then as your listeners would have known, it's these ideas sort of map on to thematic areas in the Bharatiya economy on trade, on inequality, on labor contracts, and a variety of other things in the Kautilyanomics book. Right. So the attempt was always to sort of trace the past, and then, but it also goes back to two sort of pertinent research questions, right? Besides, my core, bread and butter as a macroeconomist to deal with, macro issues, international macro and things like that. But when I chanced upon, economic history and Angus Madison's, work on economic history, I realized that, Bharat and China were the top sort of countries in the Common Era period. Right. Of course, there are. I also provide a perspective on how to sort of analyze Madison's data while focusing on the trends, but less on the actual numbers, which is a different story. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is, I was of the view that, there had to be some sort of an economic framework, some understanding, some basic philosophy, which was catalyzing this economic perspective.
Absolutely.
So that led me to Kautilya's Arthashastra, and that was the first book.
Yeah.
And even in that first book, I talk about, in the first chapter with Professor Satish Deodar at IIM Ahmedabad, who is the Dean of Faculty, I believe now. We had co-authored a paper which talks about even the pre-Kautilyan period. Because Kautilya himself argues that, scholars such as Brihaspati and Shukracharya had different views on such subjects. And even in the Rig Veda and Mahabharata and Ramayana, there are indications of not just a spiritual realm, also a practical, in Tamil we call laukika, that is more conventional or commercial, a lifestyle, which is also a concurrent reality.
Right.
So, what I'm trying to say is, as an extension of all this, I felt that these Dharma-based economic frameworks also extended to common era kingdoms. So, my research, I already had a sequel. I mean, it's a trilogy. So the first part is Kautilya's Arthashastra, Dharmanomics. Second part is Dharmanomics, which we're talking about today. And the third part is Dharma-based economic frameworks for Viksit Bharat. I mean, for the future, how do you apply a lot of these ideas, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So in the second book, I deal with the Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Kamboja Desa in Cambodia, Vietnam in Champa, and Southeast Asian kingdoms. And through three sort of pillars, I approach this subject, I mean, based on the evidence that I see. One is this Kautilyan Dharmic capitalism, which I just mentioned, through the definition of Dharma and the role of the state and things like that. Second is what I call the Dharmic ecosystem. The temple-based economies in a lot of these places. And third is on Srini Dharma, the role of Srinis as the Srini as a sort of a corporate guild, guilds who were like multinational corporations in those times. And they played a very, very important role, not just in the socio-economic landscape, but they played a very important role in the geopolitical landscape as well. So these are three sort of, components, pillars that you see. And in these kingdoms, you see various iterations. Some of them have greater emphasis on the Dharmic ecosystem. Some of them have greater emphasis on the Kautilya's, Dharmic capitalism. And some of them have an overarching influence on Srini Dharma as well. Srini Dharma. And I think these iterations are seen through the book.
Right.
The hope is to showcase to people that, lastly, the one of the other aims, I spoke of one research question on what is the indigenous sort of Bharatiya economic model. The second question is the role of culture, norms and narratives on economic decision making.
Right.
Like what is the influence of our cultural activities in our discretionary spending, which is a non-essential spending. A large section of it, in my view, even today, is governed by the way of life that you're talking about.
Right.
For example, the largest UPI transactions in the calendar year this year is during the week of Diwali.
Right. Yeah.
So there is a reason why consumer behavior, especially folks in the advertisement world would agree with this, is largely linked to the cultural connotations of the place.
Yeah.
So this way of life is a construct of thousands of years of experience and so I draw linkages from this Dharmic model.
Right.
And showcase that this Dharmic way of life is an extension of all these things.
Right.
And one hopes that, in my next book, I try to showcase how in the present some of these ideas can be implemented. Right. So this is broadly a sort of a summary of, what the work is on.
Very, very interesting, Sriramji. I think it's almost a natural flow of thought that because we, I think in India have been recognizing increasingly about the robust economy that we had in the Common Era, be it, as evidenced in the Angus Madison report. So it's wonderful that you've actually gone on and investigated, in a sense, about what is it that made that possible. So that should be a very interesting sort of a exploration for anybody who wants to understand what underpinned that economic prosperity that we had. I want to go into one of each of those some of the pillars that you laid out, but also just quickly wanted to ask you why it becomes important to sometimes look at this from a scholarly perspective, because sometimes we when we talk about our way of life, it is a way of life, so we live it. We experience it on a day-to-day basis, but why does it also become important to put down this in a scholarly manner so that we understand this in a more academic sense? So, what is the importance of that?
See, academic sense is one part of it, right?
Right. Okay.
Where I think it is even more important is from a policy sense.
Right.
Right. So most of the things that are obvious often need to be, most things in economics, frankly, are obvious. Right? But economics, whether you like it or not, plays a very overarching role compared to any other profession in how we sort of live our lives for a variety of reasons, right? Economic policy has it's sort of a confluence of politics and mathematics and application of and sociology itself, all sort of rolled into one beast. So it has, what I'm trying to say, it has a profound impact on how we live our lives. For example, post the 1990 economic reforms, you know how much transformation has taken place in how we live our lives. So having said that, I think, it is important in that sense, no matter how obvious it is, for us to create a rigorous framework. Because, for my first book, not my first book in this series, I spent almost 4 to 5 years working on that book, right? There is a reason why I spent that time. Because you essentially have to derive a framework bottom up, which means you have to see the text, see the evidence, and then create a framework across thematic areas in various, parts of the text, and then merge it into a framework, right, which is consistent across board. And it's important because as policymakers, see, most people, who need to be convinced are people who are in the middle end of the spectrum. In the sense, they aren't necessarily people who are exposed to all these ideas. Neither do they feel, have an inherent bias against these ideas. That is the majority of the population, right? I think getting a buy-in from that majority is very important. Right. Because, that's when you bring about, unless you can only do that if there is rigorous research and sort of quality time spent on it, right? Credibility is earned when there is hard work, when there's commitment to a cause. Absolutely. Right? These two books, I could easily write 5 op-eds in any major publication and then say, okay, I've done this work, right? But that's not really the point. The point really is you want to have work which is, which is critically reviewed, it's rigorous, you spend a lot of time thinking and provide provide fairly, new content. Whether you like these books or not that I've written, one thing you would agree is that this content is intended to make you think. And it is something which is not seen in other places, right? It's something, it's a different perspective of things. So what I'm trying to say is, I think credibility is earned only when you put in the rigor to produce, things like this. And I think that's where I think it's very important to do quality research, because only quality research will get you get these ideas mainstream and get a greater buy-in from a wider section of the population and policymakers who aren't really attuned to some of these ideas on their own. So eventually, I think more and more research on this subject will push the needle, and at some point, there will be transformation. So I think it's a lot of perseverance, but I think it's definitely worth it. I think that's why we should move towards.
Absolutely, Sriramji. I think a lot of viewers, listeners, also all of us recognize the need for us to look at the Indic knowledge systems. But as you mentioned, it's very important that the rigor is there, because there are many ideas out there, sometimes almost floating for some time and then sort of disappearing. But unless there is a systematic study like the one you have conducted for the second time now, it would just not add to the add value, and also not add sort of relevance to policymakers in a sense. So thanks for sharing those insights. I want to go to specifically the temple economy now, and that is a subject that you deal with in your book. So why is the temple important from an economic standpoint in the context of Bharat? What has been the what role has it played in the Indian economy historically?
See, if you really look at ancient Bharatiya history, especially southern Indian kingdoms or the kingdoms that I've covered here, and in Southeast Asia, the temple has played an important role as an economic instrument. Right. See, the temple as a religious and socio-religious instrument, entity is a well-known fact, right? We all see that, and in the realm of spirituality and things like that, it's a very sacrosanct and a very important, component of our spiritual faith. Yes. Right. But for us, appreciating, acknowledging, and admiring this particular fact, I take a step back and view it through the lens of an economic instrument.
Yeah.
See, in most of the villages that we have in Bharat today, the single biggest institution that is a driver of economic activity, in my view, is the temple. Even today. If you go to Tamil Nadu, for example, there are thousands of temples.
Right.
You take any village.
Right.
There will be a major temple.
Yeah.
And there will be a lot of plethora of smaller temples around that area.
Yeah.
Right? The ecosystem that the temple provides, the economic ecosystem, which means, the kirana shops outside the temple, all the products that is required for, the activities in the temple, the tourism that benefits from the temple, the infrastructure development, which is required for people to move from one place to another because of the temple.
Yeah.
Because in purely economic terms, what we are seeing is a sort of a completely inelastic demand.
Yeah.
Because of the temple,
Yeah.
right? Because of the bhakti and devotion, no matter what the macroeconomic environment changes, you have a constant demand for the temple, right?
Yeah.
In a sort of a materialistic sense, right?
Yeah.
So it means that this ensures that there is constant demand for the ecosystem surrounding the temple,
Yeah. Exactly.
which is independent of other macro factors. So let me try to simplify, right?
Yeah.
Let's say you're going on a yatra or on a visit to a lot of these temples, right? And you're going with family and you're deciding to spend say 5-10 lakhs for a family of say 10 people.
Yeah.
You're going for a 1 month yatra. No one would really go and look at the Reserve Bank's interest rate, while going on the yatra, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in the yatra has expenditure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you do it.
It has tourism. It does all these things, irrespective of what whether you're in a recession or not. This discretionary expenditure that you're making is going to happen.
Yeah.
So, in a purely economic sense, it is a tool which has inelastic demand, which means the ability to change this demand is very limited because of other external factors, right? So it provides an ecosystem. What I'm trying to say is, so it becomes a central ecosystem of a lot of these village entities, a lot of these cultural entities. So I think that's an important point to observe, right? So if you take the past, similarly, in the Cholas, in the Pallavas, Pandyas, you find this through and through. In fact, surprisingly enough, if you look at Kambojidesa, that is Cambodia, and Vietnam, the temple-based economic model, especially between 6th century CE, 6th, 7th century CE, till about 13th century CE, was central. That was the core construct of their economy, more or less. In the book, I try to deal with the various theories of these models. Of course, there are other views.
Right.
I think Kenneth Hall's views on this subject related to the temple-based and temple network-based economies, in my view, is the closest to the reality.
Okay.
So, I argue that in these places, the temple, because of the fact that temple had large sections of land, so it played 4 major roles, right?
Okay.
It is what I call a labor aggregator,
right?
Which means it provided a lot of employment for people in that particular village, that particular area, for a variety of roles, right? 2, more importantly, it was a financial sort of institution.
Right.
See, there's a reason why, if you really think about it, right? If you look at the major temples in Tamil Nadu, or not Tamil Nadu, take even full of India, right? Full of Bharat. Especially in the coastal, the southern and the western areas, right? You find that you will have most of the major temples within an hour's drive from the coast. So let's take Somnath, for example, right? Let's take Padmanabha Swami temple. Let's take even some of the Tanjavur temples, except for probably the Madurai Meenakshi temple, which is a bit inward. Tiruchendur in near southern Tamil Nadu. Even Puri Jagannath temple. So most of these temples are within an hour and a half drives from the coast. It's not some random. There's a logical reasoning behind it, because the temple served as financial institutions. They served as sort of financiers for a lot of the corporate guilds, the Shrenis, which I mentioned. Where they would sort of finance them, give them interest loans for a particular amount of interest rate.
Right.
And then ensure that they also serve as VC funds, venture capital funds. So in the sense that for entrepreneurial networks around the temple ecosystem, they would be offering, loans at reasonable rates.
Yeah.
And they served as financial institutions.
Right.
So that was another important role.
Yeah.
The third important role is that they served as huge redistributive functions, right? You find this a lot in the Vijayanagara Empire, where it is institutionalized quite a bit. Where, for example, in the Tirumala temple plates, you notice that the Vijayanagara Empire used the temples as a major redistributive center. So what do I mean by redistribution, right? So if you take things like inequality, right?
Yeah.
You hear a lot about inequality. So inequality, in very simple terms, is the gap between rich and poor.
Yeah.
So the rich, when the gap increases, you say there is greater income inequality between people, right? So when so in the Tirumala temple inscriptional evidence, that what you see is that a large sections of, say, donors or rich people in that particular area put in money into an endowment fund.
Right.
Okay, this endowment sort of fund helps to finance the temple.
Right.
Okay, it puts an investment into the temple and things like that. And the temple gets financed. Obviously, it's rituals and it's the entire spiritual ecosystem that is required of the temple is taken care first. And then they ensure that there are food available for free for 3 times a day for anyone who comes to the temple.
Right.
So which means the real poor, people below poverty line, are getting free food for 3 times a day. Right? So all your issues related to malnourishment or whatever it is, from lack of food, are taken care by this setup.
Yeah.
And the transfer of wealth from the rich through these endowment funds is happening to the poor in a sense. So the redistribution is happening at that level.
Right.
So these are the side of roles that the temples play.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that the temple-based economy, I mean, much of the debate around the state and the control of the temples, they're all valid debates, of course. When you look back at first principles, obviously the less the influence of the state, the better it is.
Right.
But that discussion is primarily on the revenue generated by the temple on its own.
Yeah.
But there is a temple-based economy which is outside as a benefactor of this.
Yes.
So liberating that from the shackles of the state is not a politically contentious issue, right? Which can be easily done in a strategic, in a calibrated manner.
Right. Right.
So I think there's a lot of scope in that front. And much of the, multidimensionality of the temple as an instrument, as an economic instrument, is an area which a lot of our ancestors focused on. They saw a lot of, merit in doing some of this.
Right.
And I think that also played an important role in sustainability of some of this prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting points there, Sriramji. I think you've highlighted the role of temple on multiple fronts, but also the last point that you made, which is on liberating and sort of easing the sometimes regulatory restrictions that surround the temple and the economic activities around the temple. I think that is something that is hardly spoken about in a sense, because we do have a much needed debate and discussion about, I think, the temple administration itself, about what happens inside the temple, but there is also an ecosystem around it which has to be looked at. Thanks for highlighting that.
Correct. Just one point to add further, right?
Yeah.
I'm not delegitimizing the case for temple liberation from the state.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm very much for it.
Right.
But given the political nature of it, as we try to resolve that issue, I think there is the ecosystem that the temple creates, the economic ecosystem it creates. Because much of the 1990 economic reforms, for example, focus on various areas of the state.
Right.
And we see the benefits.
Yeah.
One angle to explore is the economies of scale that are derived by this ecosystem.
Yes.
And how do you sort of liberalize this from, create greater efficiencies, make it more strategic, make it a more sort of a calibrated entity of economic opportunity for people.
Right.
And that's, I think, a point to ponder for people.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Sriramji. Now, just moving on from the temple economy to something that you've also more recently spoken about, on social media and elsewhere, and that is the debates and discussions around sustainability. The government in India has a certain framework, which is the LIFE framework, the capital L, small I, FE, lifestyle for environment. You also deal with that in your book. So, what is the role of sustainability, or rather, what enables sustainability in a dharmic economy? Do we see evidence of that in the past? How do we think about sustainability from a dharmic economic standpoint?
I think that's a very important question because sustainability inherently,
Right.
in my view, is a behavioral problem.
Right.
Right? As individuals, if we have a buy-in on leading sustainable lives, then eventually I think it will aggregate to a point where we live sustainable lives as a society together.
Yeah.
Right? I think the Honorable Prime Minister's initiative is a very welcome step. I mean, I think it gives an indication of his vision,
Right.
his enormous ability to understand this way of life that I'm talking about, because of his vast experience on the ground.
Yeah.
And also, which I've again mentioned in earlier version of Bharatvaarta itself,
Right.
one of the very underrated but extremely important observation of the Prime Minister is that he's probably the only Prime Minister after Lal Bahadur Shastri who's experienced poverty.
Yeah.
So his ability to understand, the power of, say, Ujjwal Yojana, the power of having a roof on your head, the power of lights, for example, in a village, is immense. And I think as an extension, his ability to understand this way of life is a good benchmark to understand how his policies are executed.
Yeah.
And in that context, I think this lifestyle for environment is a very, very important initiative. And I think it's inherently these behavioral choices that I'm talking about, where the role of Dharma plays an important role. Because inherently, the Dharmic way of life is sustainable.
Right. Yeah.
So, the responsibilities that I spoke about in the definition of Dharma through Kautilya.
Yeah.
So, Kautilya himself talks about, familial responsibilities, societal responsibilities, environmental responsibilities in 3rd century BCE.
Yeah.
And the need for all of this.
Yeah.
So, I think among the definitions of Dharma, you also notice that there's a focus on Saucham, cleanliness, as one of the definitions. We are all inherently clean in our own societies. And we also need to bring it through a neighborhood. So, in fact, one person made an observation to me in Tamil Nadu, for example, in most of the villages, when they draw the kolam every morning, in a sense, you also ensure that your cleanliness is transferred to the outside area within your neighborhood in a very natural, organic manner. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of the principles are based on Dharma, either through the prism of responsibilities or through the prism of some of the behavioral actions, are inherently sustainable. Yeah. So the lifestyle that this movement is talking about is a form of way of life that is inherently sort of sustainable, and it looks at sustainable practices not because some state has imposed something on you, but because that's how the nature of lifestyle has been for thousands of years. Yeah. So I think that's a very important observation. I think it's something that one needs to flesh out more and sort of articulate in a coherent, research-driven manner for policymakers to pick up this more. Yeah. But this intrinsic nature, I think, is a very important quality.
Indeed. Absolutely, Sriramji. When we speak of policy, the other area of policy is also, when we look at, let's say, foreign policy. Of course, in modern times or in today's times, the way foreign policy, foreign relations is conducted is very different from what it was in ancient times or medieval times, for that matter. And you're somebody who's lived in different parts of the world and have worked and lived, so you understand sometimes these cultural differences that we see. How did India interact economically with its, let's say, neighboring spaces or far off spaces, be it through trade or otherwise? Because you also mention about the role of Srini's Dharma in this. Can you tell us about that? Like, one is, of course, how India interacted and how in terms of economic interactions with the rest of the world. And the other is also whether this model was also shared in a sense outside of what we today know as political boundaries of India? Because you mentioned that this is also something that was, let's say, in Cambodia. It was a similar model. So, what was the sort of international angle to this, if I may ask?
Yeah, there's a lot of geopolitics,
Right.
geo-economics politics,
Right,
put it
right.
that way, in this. So first of all, let me start with Srinis, right?
Right.
These corporate guilds played a very important role, like what I mentioned.
Yeah.
And they were, independent organizations.
Okay.
The state did not have much role in them. They were extremely egalitarian.
Right.
They had people across caste, creed, communities.
Okay.
In fact, nationalities. There are even Jews who are part of
Oh, interesting.
some of these guilds.
Wow.
Foreigners are also part of these guilds.
Okay.
So they had a sort of a very democratic process of choosing their leadership and things like that, and a very egalitarian system, right? So, in fact, the first chapter I sort of talk about this. And for those who are interested, Professor Vikramaditya Khanna, who's a good friend of mine from UMich Ann Arbor, he's done a brilliant paper on this, which can be Googled, which talks a lot about the Srinis.
Okay.
I even extend this to some of the Saraswati Sindhu phase itself, based on my interpretation.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to say is, if there is an institution which is extended for thousands of years,
Right.
it's basically the Srinis.
Right.
And the Srini had an important role in the socio-economic prosperity that we're talking about. Right? And central to this socio-economic prosperity, they were like multinational corporations. They had offices in various parts of Indonesia. They had people in Champa in Vietnam, in Cambodia. And they were sort of, traders, corporations, like organizations like FICCI, all rolled into one. Right?
Right.
And they also played an important role in financing a lot of these, kingdoms, including the Cholas. And therefore, they also played a role in the geopolitics of it.
Yeah.
So, for example, Rajendra Chola, that is Rajaraja Chola's son. So, for people who are not aware, Rajaraja Chola was one of the famous kings. I mean, you see Ponniyin Selvan, which is the movie which talks about the Cholas.
Yeah.
Rajaraja Chola built the Brihadishwara temple.
Yes.
Right? His son Rajendra Chola was the one who conquered various parts of India as well as northern India. So he conquered northern India. So that's why in Tamil Nadu you have a town called Gangai Konda Cholapuram.
Okay.
Which basically means Gangai Konda Cholapuram. The king, the Cholan who went to Ganga, conquered and came back.
Okay.
So he built a city which is, has a replica of the Bharatvaarta temple itself there. So similarly, he also conquered Southeast Asia. He went to Kedah and all these places. But there's a reason why they conquered, but they did not rule these places. Okay. Generally, when you cross these oceans, right?
Yeah.
You go all the way and you want to rule that place, no?
Yeah.
But that didn't really happen.
Okay.
One of the reasons for them to even make this journey was because of the Srinis. So there is a guild called Ain Nurvar.
Okay.
It's called 500, literal translation in Tamil.
Okay.
It is a very powerful, one of the biggest guilds in the Common Era.
Okay.
So they were trading, within Southeast Asia. And basically the trading routes are like from Middle East, they go all the way to the Straits of Malacca.
Okay.
And then go under, say, Singapore.
Okay.
And then go towards China.
Okay.
So while they were trading in the Straits of Malacca, the Srivijaya kingdom was the ones that they were in Java and Sumatra. Those are the areas where they were dominating. While they had decent relations with them, at some point what had happened is they started stifling these guilds from functioning.
Okay.
So this led them not to trade to China, and it affected their entire commerce or their economic, financing structure.
Right.
So, and then in combination, the Cambodian king at that time had some issues apparently with the Srivijaya kingdom.
Yeah.
So the Cholas, because of this reason, this is one of the reasons though.
Yeah.
Of course, for these type of events, you have many versions.
Yeah.
Is that because of these two factors, the Cholas went and conquered to ensure that they liberated the guild so that they can function properly.
Easily.
And that's why once they conquered, they didn't really rule as long as this was sorted, and then they did the right activity. So this is a very good example of how a commercial entity has an important geopolitical influence. And then in terms of diplomacy as well, right? So the Cholas were also close to the Kambojidesa kings, the Cambodia kings, which is, pretty like what I mentioned.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Cambodia and Champa, Vietnam, had a sort of a hot and cold relationship. Because Vietnam has a very sort of a refined coast.
Yeah.
Okay, where many cities were there. In fact, these cities I mentioned in my book.
Okay.
They were called Panduranga. They were called Vijaya. They were all given Indic names.
Okay.
In all these, cities, coastal cities. But they had a sort of always a hot and cold relationship because the Vietnamese ports were very lucrative for any Cambodian king. But despite that, the Cholas had equally good relations with both Kambojidesa and Cambodia, as well as the Champa kingdoms, right? And they established, diplomatic, negotiations with them and helped each of them in their own sort of, geopolitical issues. Similarly, they also had, interactions with the Chinese through the Chinese embassy notes. They sent missionaries to China. So a lot of the, diplomatic sort of maneuverings were all very common, they're all common parlance during this time. Only difference is obviously compared to today's time in terms of technology, in terms of the instant gratification we talk about, instant information that we get. That was obviously lacking though during those times.
Right.
But the conceptual need to have engagement with the rest of the countries and have geopolitical tie-ups with the rest of the countries and alliances were all quite common.
Right.
So these are some examples. In fact, Dr. Jaishankar mentioned in a couple of speeches before of this discovery of the 7th century Shiva temple in Vietnam.
Right.
So I also mentioned about it in my book.
Okay.
And those are some examples, where geopolitics and economics were intertwined.
Yeah, very interesting because a lot of it actually echoes sometimes when you look at geopolitics of today as well, where economic pathways or trade pathways, when they are blocked, become the center of geopolitics. So it is very fascinating that this happened back then as well, and the Srinis actually were at the center of the spotlight, so to say. Sriramji, we had discussed a little bit about, regulations and, the need to ease up, economic activities around the temple. But beyond the temple as well, more generally, many of the aspects of a Dharmic economic model are very much alive today. We see that everywhere in our society. However, there are, systematic sort of obstacles for societies, for somebody who wants to pursue enterprise, to actually see that to fruition. What is the role of policy then, in a sense? Because to actually tap into this potential, many of these institutions, temples are there in most parts of in parts of India. You still have that temple ecosystem. It is in a way sort of weighed down by the burden of regulations, weighed down by the burden of sometimes even politics, but it's there. It's surviving even now after centuries. How do we sort of rekindle the energy that there is by removing these obstacles that we frequently face? So what would your sort of message be on the policy making front to actually sort of tap into this potential?
Yeah, I think it's important to, again, in these type of complex sort of, complex ideas and years of research, sometimes you need to sort of take a step back, right? And look at the big picture of things.
Yeah.
I think that's how we need to approach this, right?
Okay.
So coming back again to the sort of two research questions I mentioned, right?
Yeah.
One is, what is the indigenous Bharatiya model, which we established through all these things, the qualitative frameworks.
Yeah.
Two is, what is the role of culture, norms, narratives in economic decision making?
Right.
So this provides you the framework for all these years.
Right.
And it doesn't just stop, right?
Yeah.
It leads us to where we are in terms of the way of life that you're talking about, right? Which of course, as you mentioned, it leads to economic choices that we are making.
Right.
And it plays an important role in economic decisions that we are making.
Right.
Not just at the individual level, but even at the corporate level, right? let's take the top 15 companies in this country, right? Almost 9 to 10 companies are all family-driven firms.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
The 10 biggest companies in this country, most of them are family-driven firms. I mean, they might be publicly listed, but they're predominantly run by a major family that runs the show.
Yeah.
Right? Most of these families make business choices not bounded always on rationality. They make business choices which is accumulation of factors of which their cultural upbringing, norms, narratives plays a very important role in their decision making. Right?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is this way of life doesn't just affect individuals such as us, but the way of life reflects also the sort of wealth creators of this country.
Yeah.
Right? That's how their choices are made. Right?
Yeah.
So its influence is significant.
Yeah.
Right? Anyone who sort of wants to underplay this is just being blind to the reality.
Yeah.
Right? Because whether you like it or not, this is the reality.
Yeah.
Right? So once you're confronted with such a reality, it is important to acknowledge also the fact that these things did not emanate today.
Yeah.
Right? These things have been in this country for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Which means they are very difficult for policy makers, no matter how ingenious you think you are, for you to fundamentally change these things. Because they are beyond the construct of the material world. In the sense, there is a way of life which has been inherently there for a long period of time, and that's how it is.
Yeah.
So, what I'm trying to say is, it would be prudent and it would be, important for policymakers to understand this way of life and align policy to the way of life, rather than the other way around. See, much of post-independent India, for a variety of reasons, we are a poor nation, we had to come out of poverty, and we did a variety of things. But the underlying theme is that there was a bunch of people, most of them well-intentioned, who were extremely privileged from post-independent movement, in terms of education, in terms of their background, in terms of society. And their Western sort of driven education, thinking and models became sort of the numero uno sort of thing that the rest of the country has to do. Right. But their exposure to and their worldview is limited to this elite consumption by and large. Right. So that post the economic reforms of 1990 has changed gradually but substantively. Right. So if you really think about it, the generation of people who are in their 40s today are people who are probably in their early childhood during that time.
Yeah.
So these are people of the aspirational class from the middle class who have rise through the economic ladder purely, with the role of markets and role of reforms and things like that.
Yeah.
So and more importantly, these are people who are democratized. Their views are sort of democratized across the board because they come from all walks of life.
Right.
Okay, not restricted by geography or class or that creed.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, most of the policy before used to be that there's a certain prescription of policy, and then there's the way of life which keeps parallelly happening.
Yeah.
And in cases where there's a conflict, the policy just doesn't become effective.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we are at a stage where it is important that people acknowledge this fact and design policy in a way it is aligned to the way of life so that it's far more effective.
Yeah.
So I gave the example of the PM's, lifestyle movement. Similarly, Swachh Bharat is another example, right?
Yeah.
Where using this idea of Saucham and appealing to their sort of dharmic consciousness, put it that way, and then taking this to the outer neighborhood and society, it has become almost autopilot, especially in rural areas nowadays. If you go to even in Tamil Nadu or any major village or any villages, most of the villages in India, you see that besides the main bazaar street, the rest of the streets are all fairly reasonably clean. And the Swachhata clinics have made a important contribution. But more than that, I think it has struck a chord with the people, especially in rural areas, on the need for them to be, on the need for them to transfer their dharmic consciousness to the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right? This is a very good example of effective public policy acknowledging people's way of life.
Yeah.
And I think if you want to really enhance the effectiveness and sort of take public policy in a way where it is beyond the pressures of the state and who's in power, and I think acknowledging and appreciating this way of life is a very important tool for policymakers, and it helps to sort of move policy making to the way of life rather than the other way.
Yeah, very, very true, Sriramji. I think you've mentioned an important point that the policy cannot be in conflict or in rupturing the way of life, but rather when they are in alignment, that leads to better outcomes. Purely from an economic sense as well, in terms of efficiency and things like that, but also is very much desirable from a societal standpoint, and even I think from the point of view of some of the global challenges that we are facing right now. Because like you previously mentioned, there's a lot there for a global audience as well. So if somebody wants to really understand how Indians make economic choices, or how they have been making Indian economic choices, I think this is the best sort of illustration for that. I just want you to also just talk about your upcoming projects, and because you mentioned that this book is going to be part of a trilogy, what if you can just tell us a little bit about that, and we of course look forward to your next book as well.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, right? So I dealt with. So you've dealt almost with 2,500 plus years in these two books. So how do you sort of get these ideas into contemporary Bharat?
Right.
For Viksit Bharat, where does one think, these ideas can fit in?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the book that I'm working on.
Right.
And of course, any wholesale change, especially in a democratic polity, is a pipe dream. So, I think there are ways in which these ideas can make a contribution in nudging policy in a way where it can be far more effective.
Yeah.
So I highlight a lot of examples. For example, I give this concept of Dharmic nudges.
Okay.
Where you use some of these cultural connotations and cultural events and cultural activities, and use that as a productive tool for economic policy, implementation. Yeah. Right? So how do you sort of do that? So these are some ideas which I focus on.
Yeah.
And then how do you sort of institutionally look at some of these trends, like how, in terms of like the sustainability index, how do you sort of look at a Dharmic sort of an index, which can facilitate better policy making?
Right.
So I try to focus on some of these ideas,
right.
Expand more on the temple-based economies as well, to give more data and to give more information. And provide a perspective on some of the challenges that Bharat will have in the years to come. Things like urbanization, right? We have reached an inflection point where continuous urbanization is counterproductive.
Right.
So how do you create tier 2, tier 3 centers of economic independence, and how some of these things can play a role in that?
Yeah.
So these are some ideas which I'm working on, which will be in a new book. But of course, it's a new topic, and you're exploring, you're researching, and it requires a lot of perseverance. I mean,
absolutely.
Generally itself you get pushback on a lot of these things, but I think I'm inherently passionate, and I strongly believe that if we are to be Viksit Bharat, you have to deal with both the informal economy and the way of life that I'm talking about, none of which are going to go away. And in this transformation, what is crucial is how do these stakeholders transform themselves in the process? And what does this transformation mean to these sections of people?
Yeah.
And are they on board with this transformation?
Right.
And how do you keep them on board? And I think answering these questions requires a lot more rigor, a lot more patience, a lot of open-mindedness.
Yes.
But eventually, I think it is important to know all this, because that's when the sustainability part will be taken care. And that's when, we'll move to a more equitable and sustainable and indigenous sort of model that I referred to.
Extremely critical questions that you have laid out for all of us who think about economic transformation, who think about economic growth. And like you mentioned, India being at the critical juncture that it is when we are talking about the Vikasit Bharat period, which is ahead of us, when we are talking about the need to improve people's lives through prosperity, those I think are the questions that policymakers, media, and all of us really as citizens of India should be asking. Thank you for very accurately and beautifully articulating that. Of course, in the podcast, but the book as well, which I would highly encourage our viewers and listeners to check out. It is Dharmanomics. And thank you so much, Sriramji, for your time and sharing your insights with us, and most importantly for making this scholarly contribution, which I think will go a long way in helping all of us understanding, economic and contextualizing economic growth in the context of Bharat.
Thank you. Namaste, and thanks a lot for both Bharatvaarta as well as to your listeners. Of course, feel free to buy the book. It's right here. And it's available on Amazon and any other platform, Padega India, and other major platforms. Please, read it, review it, debate it, if you have any thoughts, you can also reach out to me. But it's important that as readers, you encourage scholarship in these areas, so that there's greater research on such areas. Once again, thanks to all of you. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Namaste. Thank you.
Thank you.